Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about housing affordability in Canada and what laws make it easier or harder to afford a home in this country. According to recent data from the public policy organization Demographia, which ranks housing unaffordability internationally, Canadians are more priced out of their own markets than Americans, Brits, or even Singaporeans. The average home in the Greater Toronto Area is over $1 million, with detached homes at a high of $1.4 million. The average detached home in Metro Vancouver just peaked at over $1.9 million this June. Home ownership, it was one of the core aspirations of the middle class, but it's becoming apparent that in Canada, and especially in Canadian cities, home ownership is for the wealthy. What's driving this unaffordability? What laws are contributing to making homes in Canada and our major cities so out of reach? Here today to discuss these questions are three experts: post-media journalist Tristan Hopper, Steve Lafleur, senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute, and Chris Spoke, founder of the nonprofit Housing Matters. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Mr. Hopper, I'd like to start with you. You recently wrote in the National Post that the number one reason housing is so expensive in Canada is zoning laws. Can you explain what you mean?
Yeah, basically. So we have a severely constrained supply of housing in Canada. So if you look at the rest of the G7 and you look at just units of housing per capita, we're by far the lowest of any other country in the G7. In fact, if we were to get to the level of the next lowest, which is the UK, we would have to build 250,000 units of housing just to get to the UK level. And if you look at the city of Vancouver, that's roughly the amount of homes in the entire city of Vancouver. So we're really, really behind on building homes. And one of the main reasons for that is anybody who's ever, redeveloped a home or looked to expand a home or built a home, basically every jurisdiction in Canada makes it a huge pain in the butt to do that. There's basically a lattice work of zoning laws, which make it difficult to create new builds in Canada, and that constrains the supply, which drives up the price. So the argument I made in the National Post was, if you took any other sector of the economy and did this, you would have a similar effect. So cars, we've got 2 million cars sold in Canada per year. If you had a bunch of government regulations which limited that to 1 million cars per year, your Ford Fiesta would be, rising 20% per year, just like, your average Vancouver crack shack.
So, Mr. Lafleur, what's your take? Do you think it's zoning laws that's the main driver for housing unaffordability, or is there something else at play here as well?
Well, just from a 36,000 foot level, the GTA and the Greater Vancouver area of Lower Mainland both have this dual squeeze happening, where not only are we constraining outward expansion, so there's the agricultural land reserve in Vancouver, and there's the Greenbelt in Toronto, but we also are preventing upward development as well of all kinds. So, people like to point to all the large condo buildings going up and say, we've got a condo, what's the problem? Obviously, it's just foreign investors driving the prices. The reality is, this is a small part of the city that's really getting developed. They're maximizing the amount they can build on these small parcels. But really, when you look at most of the city, it's detached houses. It's mostly only zoned for single detached houses. So obviously, for pros and cons to, allowing more sprawl, et cetera. But from a 36,000 foot perspective, you have to build somewhere, and we're just not building enough.
So, Mr. Spoke, what's your take? What do you think is the main driver of unaffordability in Canada?
Yeah, well, I think there are two big things, right? So prices are a function of supply and demand. So on the demand side, a lot of people move to Canada, and I think we generally kind of like that. We like that people want to move to Canada, and within Canada, people move to our cities. Within our cities, the points that Tristan and Steve made is that we're not allowing for enough housing to be built. So on one hand, we have a lot of demand for housing. On the other hand, we're constraining the supply of housing. And that just like the basic economics of that is that prices rise.
I want to touch, when we come back from the next commercial break, on the issue that Steve mentioned of foreign investment, because I think in some cities, Vancouver and Toronto in particular, we have a lot of policymakers who are saying that is the main driver of unaffordability, and they're implementing a number of policies. Ontario and Vancouver have both implemented policies to address this foreign investment in those city markets, in those provincial markets as well. So I want to talk to you both, or all three of you, when we're back from the commercial break, about what impact policies like that have and what impact foreign investment has on the market. We will be right back from this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about what laws are driving housing unaffordability. Now, Mr. Spoke, I left the last segment asking you what role foreign capital is playing in driving up prices and what you think of policies that discourage overseas investment that drives up prices. For example, one of the policies that's been implemented is taxes on foreign buyers. Do you think this will help solve the problem?
I don't think so. I think this is a bit of a scapegoat solution. So we have a lot of foreign buyers in Toronto, for example, that buy condos pre-construction, and then once these units are built, they then rent them out to locals, right? So what you need to think about is not who owns it or who's financing the unit, but who's actually living in it. And these are like local Canadian residents are renting these units. So if you swapped out foreign investment for like private equity, you still end up with the same number of units built because it's the land use rules that really constrain supply. So I think that is a bit of a scapegoat type solution, and that we're not addressing the real problem, which are these land use rules that Tristan mentioned.
So, Mr. Lafleur, what about taxes on vacant homes, which is another thing that policy developers are considering and in some places are implementing?
So here's the thing. These things have already been done. You can move the dial a little bit more, but it's not like we're not doing anything on it. So even if you assume that's a problem, which, by the way, I don't really think it is a huge problem, they've already done it. And in Vancouver, there was a report from City or UBC. There was a report that found there were a few thousand units that got onto the market as a result of these policies. Fine, okay, but you could also build condo units, and you'd get the same effect. So, given that they've already brought down the hammer, it's really questionable why just moving the dial is supposed to do anything. I can't imagine what they would have to do in terms of the tax rate to really, really move it further than it's already been moved.
Mr. Hopper, I know that you've pointed out that zoning can be a problem, but what about the cost of development? There's a whole lot of development laws and regulations that contribute to the price of building a home. What can you tell me about those laws and the impact that they have? And can you give me an example of how they contribute to the price, an example of a type of development charge that you think is causing particular damage?
Oh, sure. Yeah. First, I think I'm more sympathetic than the other two guests to the idea that foreign capital is having some effects on the market. Like, obviously, if you have foreign capital coming in and buying huge swaths of housing, like I knew people who lived in condos in downtown Vancouver where like their entire floor was empty, and these were all investment properties. So if you have parts of the real estate market turned into a financial product, that's going to have an effect. And 10 years ago, I would have thought that was the sole effect, which turned out to be wrong because, as Mr. Lafleur mentioned, we have had measures here in BC to sort of discourage it. It's had some effect on driving down prices, but it's certainly not nearly what we thought. It hasn't, suddenly made Vancouver affordable. And actually, a good example of, how little it can do in the big scheme of things is New Zealand actually has really tight regulations about foreign ownership. Their rule is if you're a foreigner who wants to buy property, and most famously, Canadian director James Cameron lives in New Zealand and buys property there. If you want to move there, you have to purchase a new build. So you can't have foreigners buying up the existing housing stock and pricing everyone out. And they have a worse problem with real estate affordability than we have. It's going even higher. So clearly there are other factors to play. So further to your question about development, while I think zoning and the inability to create new houses is sort of the main problem here, every time you have some new measure for housing, it gets more and more difficult each year to build a house. There are more environmental regulations. There are more survey regulations. So every time these are implemented, it's weird. You'll see a government that is all about housing affordability. And then, in the same month, they'll put forward some new like green regulation on homes, not realizing that is going to have an effect on the price of homes. And every time you put in some new measure that adds like $500, $1,000 to the cost of a new home, that's another few people that are getting priced out of the market. So any extra cost, anything that makes it more difficult to buy a home means that less people are going to be able to buy homes.
So, Mr. LaFleur, can you give me an example of one of these development charges that you think could easily be eliminated to help improve housing affordability?
Well, so first I'll say the impact of charges is somewhat ambiguous in the sense that in some communities, charges are just really high because people demand high amenities and it becomes the cost of doing business. Like when the supply is as constrained as it is and there are bidding wars that people spending 10, 20,000 more, over asking, it's not clear that that's as big of an issue of just the overall lack of supply. I just want to go back for a second on the foreign buyers thing.
But Steve, before we do that, we do have to go to commercial break, but I'll let you finish your thought when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about what laws impact the affordability of houses in Canada. Now, Mr. LaFleur, before the commercial break, you wanted to make a point about foreign investment. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that, yes, supply and demand definitely matter. So within our current levels of supply, certainly having an influx of foreign capital can increase prices. There's no question about that. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is, why is it that foreign investors are determining that this asset class is worth betting on? And frankly, it looks like what they're betting on is that we're not going to increase the supply of housing. If we were, it wouldn't make as much sense. Recently, there was some news about hedge funds investment firms like BlackRock buying up single detached houses in the United States. And there was a similar story in Canada. And, one of the points that people made is that, if you want to crush BlackRock, build more houses. If you increase the supply of something, the inverse happens, price should go down. And they're betting on that not happening.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Now, Mr. Spoke, I wanted to ask you, shifting gears a little, about some of the policies that the Trudeau government's announced recently. They said that they're going to be investing in the creation of new affordable housing units, these are going to be homes for people who are in vulnerable housing situations. Do you have a view on how a policy like that, or making more affordable rental housing, could have on the market for housing?
I think they're kind of missing the forest for the trees. So if you advance an affordable housing project in the city of Toronto, for example, you're faced with the same land use constraints as if you were, affording a luxury condo project. So in either case, you're constrained by these land use rules that make it hard for you to build. And if you don't build enough upmarket housing, people kind of bump down to mid-market housing. You don't build enough mid-market housing, they bump down maybe into below market rate housing, and then into social housing, and all the way down through the stack. So I think without addressing kind of this core issue that the middle class is being priced out of home ownership and even affordable rents, the problem is just going to get worse. And you could kind of tinker at the margins and build more super affordable housing, but you're just pushing more people into that need category by not building housing at all levels of income.
Mr. Hopper, I want to get to the core of what's causing this. Why do you think the government is enacting policies like high development charges, high super regulated zoning restrictions? Why do you think they're doing this if it's contributing so much to the unaffordability of housing, when they're on the other side saying, oh, we want to make housing more affordable?
This is one of the more insidious parts of this, is that if you bought a house in East Vancouver for $86,000, and that was the average price back then, which, is maybe like $300,000 with inflation.
I don't even know if that would buy you a parking space in Vancouver.
No, it would
today.
not. I know for a fact that would not buy you a parking space. And now you're sitting on $1.4 million. So you have a very large constituency of people who have essentially won the lottery because of bad government policy, and maybe aren't going to be tremendously motivated to see that bad policy repealed. So, further to what Mr. Spoke was saying, you have governments, whenever affordable housing comes up, they kind of address this peripheral issue. I've certainly seen that here on Vancouver Island. They'll say, oh, okay, we bought this hotel to house the homeless. And it's like, well, we're not talking about housing the homeless. We're talking about the thousands of families who have to live way out in the suburbs and commute 1 hour one way just to be able to live properly. Those are entirely separate issues. And you have an issue that could be solved and has been solved. If you looked at the reason houses were so cheap in the 1980s is because in the 1970s, you had a regime that essentially incentivized people to build, and we had an overbuilding problem in Canada. So we could do that again with some relatively easy policy measures. But again, if I was to look at the most sort of cynical reason why governments aren't addressing this, it's because a lot of people got really rich on the backs of younger generations, new Canadians, any number of people who cannot afford to live properly, and aren't hugely motivated to see those policies change.
Mr. Lafleur, we've got about 40 seconds. What's your response to what Mr. Hopper is saying? What do you think is behind the government saying, on one hand, they want to increase affordable housing, but on the other hand, enacting laws that make housing unaffordable?
I think the other challenge is that inconvenience has become the litmus test for whether something should be built. We've all heard the stories about, community hub parking lots and so forth, and, trees that are too valuable to knock down to build housing. We need to rebalance the scales. We need to be more critical about any objection to building houses. We recognize that there is a crisis. We need to build some. It might be in your backyard. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point. We will be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about what laws drive housing unaffordability. Now, Mr. Spoke, can you tell me about how building for density can increase affordability and what barriers are in place for building denser cities?
Yeah, so I think the basic logic is that housing is expensive because there's not enough of it. If we build more housing, all else equal, prices will come down. I think it was Steve who made the point that a lot of our cities are kind of constrained by these green belt and kind of urban sprawl minimizing policies. So if you're not going to build out, you pretty much have to build up if you're going to build at all. So this is called infill development. And it's the idea that if you have a piece of land with a low-rise house on it or a few low-rise houses on it, you might replace that with a mid-rise or high-rise building and increase the number of units that are on that same piece of land. So you're just building more homes for more people, making it so that more people could afford more homes.
But Mr. Hopper, is there a demand issue here? Is there a disconnect between an obvious consumer preference for detached homes and government preferences for density? And if government actually prefers density, which they say they do, are the regulations really encouraging building for density?
No, I'd say probably the most illustrative graphic that kind of gets to the root of this whole problem. UBC has been doing a program to actually look at the zoning laws all throughout the city of Vancouver, and this is true across all of Canada, but it's obviously most apparent in Vancouver. And they track how much of the city, the zoning laws across the city. So you have a very small core in the middle in which you can build these condo towers, and then everywhere else, like more than 80% of Metro Vancouver, it is illegal to build anything more dense than a single unit home. So you look at other cities around the world, like Paris is one of the densest cities in the world. It doesn't really actually have a lot of skyscrapers. It just has a lot of 3- and 4-story buildings all over the place. So yeah, you basically have this core of people who live in what is becoming a very large city and think they can live in a sprawling suburb for the rest of time. And we have governments that are, basically forming laws to respect that. And then when they make these crazy, unreasonable demands, Mr. Lafleur was mentioning, I mean, I have a dear friend here in Victoria, he lives in a condo building. They're demolishing a motel that's next door, and they're talking about building like a 6-story condo building. Not a big deal. You wouldn't even notice it. And he's going to the barricades and writing to the city council to get that stopped. We need to aggressively stop listening to these people because we have a much bigger problem on our hands.
Mr. Lafleur, we've been talking a lot about housing affordability as it relates to cities, but what's happening in suburban areas and in rural areas of Canada?
So the pandemic has really scrambled the map a lot. Obviously, in early days, when there was a lot of talk about, the death of cities and everybody fleeing to the suburbs, a lot of people were panic buying. It's hard to say to what extent that'll keep going. It'll depend a lot on what the future of work looks like. But certainly it has changed things to the point where communities that didn't really think about housing prices all of a sudden think a lot about housing prices.
Mr. Spoke, we've got about a minute and a half left. What would you say is your number one recommendation to policymakers about how to make housing more affordable in this country?
Yeah, so I think you do need to address zoning. To give you an example, in Toronto, 2/3 of our residential land is zoned RD, which stands for residential detached. So in 2/3 of our residential land, you could only build a detached house. And I think that if you look at the old city of Toronto, where you have a lot of kind of like walk-up 4-story apartment buildings mixed in with townhouses and triplexes and fourplexes, the neighborhoods actually feel quite nice. They're walkable. They're dense enough to support local coffee shops. So I would say that we have to do away with detached housing zoning, which is not to say do away with all detached houses. If you think that's the highest and best use for your land, go ahead, God bless, build a detached house. But more likely, the economics and the feasibility of the site will probably push for denser development, which will just allow for more people to live in our neighborhoods.
Mr. Hopper, in about 20 seconds, your number one recommendation.
Yeah, similar. It would just be basically, usually when you try and get a zoning law overturned, it's on a property by property basis in a lot of places. So you just need to start enacting citywide, like, boom, this is all zoned for this. Everybody can have a backyard unit. We don't have to review every single freaking application and disincentivize anybody who wants to do it.
Well, great recommendations. I want to thank you all so much for joining me today for this important conversation. I hope our policymakers are listening. We've heard today about the outrageous cost of housing in Canada and how our laws are making the supply even more expensive rather than more affordable. Why is there so much resistance to development in Canada? Why does a country with some of the most land in the world have such a problem making room for everyone? And what can we do to improve this situation? How do we push back against the not in my backyard mentality to build better cities and communities? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.